from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. Before we dive in, I just wanted to slip a little bug in your ear about our submissions. Yes, we're open for full submissions, and yes, we've doubled our rate for original stories, which, I might add, has resulted in a record-breaking submissions period so far. But one thing we're particularly hungry for is some more flash fiction. Tiny morsels of 2,000 words or less that chill the bones in the most potent way. So, if you've got any little worms wriggling around that imagination of yours, threatening to eat their way out through your gray matter, I promise, let them out and we'll take very good care of them. Visit talestoterrify.com/submissions for details and a link to submit. Whether you're a first-time author or have a legion of terrors to your name, we'd love to hear from you. A huge thank you this week goes out to our newest patron, John Montgomery. Thank you for feeding the ravenous darkness, John. It not only helps us keep bringing these terrifying tales, but limits the number of limbs we have to sacrifice to do it. If you'd like to join us behind the veil like John, visit patreon.com/talestoterrify. We've just started a new bonus series this month featuring interviews with some of our most prolific authors, conducted by our very own Seth Williams. A talk with our first victim, Patrick Barb, is up now, with several more fan favorites on their way in the coming months. So sign up and tune in. You won't regret it. We have one tale for you tonight, which comes to us from Nathaniel Matthews Lee. Nate puts words in various orders. Sometimes people give him money afterward. No one knows why. You can find more of his writing at mirrorshards.net, including a lot of free short and microfiction, and a very intermittently updated blog. Listen with me, children of the night, to Nathaniel Matthews Lee's The Ship's Cat, a Tales to Terrify original.
Testimony of Robert Werner, sailor, HMS Santo Domingo, 1872. I went to sea when I was 12, and I know what you'll have heard about Her Majesty's Navy, but sometimes a young lad going to sea is just what it is. My father was dead, and my mother was in no fit state to care for herself, let alone anyone else. As an inheritance, my father had spent the last shreds of his family's credit on an education for me, his first and only son. And I grew up on debt and tales of exploration in the age of sail. I was a starry-eyed lad, and if I was to make my own way in the world, I wanted it to be an adventure. I listened to all the broadsheets of the great explorers and their discoveries, the tantalizing Northwest Passage, the Spice Road to the Orient, the mysteries of the Arctic and Antarctic seas. I wanted to see all the lands of the empire and beyond, to taste the fruits of distant shores and watch the sun set on snow-topped mountains. I was a gullible little nitwit, in other words. My enthusiasm must have charmed the captain of the Hibernia, because he took me on as a cabin boy. It turned out that the Hibernia was a fishing vessel, and I spent my first year at sea reeking of sardine guts, trying to sleep through the screaming of the ever-hungry gulls. That was 17 years ago, and I've never taken a berth on a fish boat since. For men of my station, there's only so far one can rise through the ranks, whatever the officers tell the papers, but I'm comfortable enough. I know my duties and I do them well, and I've got a half-dozen letters of recommendation when I need a new ship to sail with. So it was that when I found myself running out of pocket, I had little trouble securing a new place on board the Santo Domingo, and if I'd known then what I do now, I'd have burned my letters and fled, rather than step foot on that cursed ship. The Santo Domingo was allegedly a quiet trading vessel, but most of what we actually traded in was dead men. The captain, an unspeaking giant of a man by the name of Adams, had a letter of marque to privateer and an unyielding hatred for the Spanish. I hold myself well enough in a fight, and I've seen enough mishaps on the sea to keep steady under pressure, but I prefer to avoid bloodshed as much as I can, and so I found for myself the duties likeliest to keep me below decks, and resolved to abscond as soon as my papers were up. I became a sort of accessory chef and errand boy, helping the unfortunately accurately named ship's cook Piggins with his duties, which he had difficulty executing because he had grown so rotund by this stage of his life that he had trouble fitting into the galley. He was tremendously grateful for my assistance, and I thus passed many a tense standoff or dangerous artillery work, happily frying salt pork and griddle cakes. Between my assigned duties and my newly discovered fondness for the culinary arts, I also befriended the ship's cat, a sporting black Tom with 2 white mittens and a dashing white moustache, inexplicably named Clootie Dumpling. I determined from his markings that he was a well-dressed and high-class man about town, and privately referred to him as Sir Clootie of Dumpling, or his Lordship de Clute, Marquis of Dumplington, while delivering scratches and pets and general fawning over his person. Ships have had cats since there were ships and rats. When one puts a great pile of stored food all in one dark, cramped room for 3 months at a time, one is more or less announcing a grand ball to the entire local rodent population, and, if left unchecked, a handful of happily nibbling rats can quickly become a horde. There's no way to prevent them from sneaking on board. They can cling to ropes like spiders and will swim if they must, and they smell a meal from miles. The only solution is to try to keep the population in check well enough that the food stores last until the ship makes landfall once more. Hence the welcoming of nature's perfect counterweight to the scourge of rats on board any vessel worth salt. Or they ought to be welcome. Sailing men are a crude sort, and in the absence of entertainment would frequently play with ship's cats. I had seen cats with tails dipped in tar and lit aflame, or tied into bags and dunked into the sea until their calls faded from rage to anguish to silence. On the Santo Domingo, the attitude was one of barely achieved tolerance, and many a curse and kick was aimed at the cat whenever he dared poke a whisper above deck. I did my best to keep him safe and near my sight. So it was that once or twice a day my brave Lord Clootie would approach me with a tail held proud and a limp ratty body in his mustachioed mouth. This he would drop at my feet and announce his victory upon the field with a great meowing. and I would bestow upon him in her stead the thanks of Her Majesty for his loyal service to her nation, and also occasionally a bit of dripping, which he accepted with the innate grace and dignity of his kind. The Santo Domingo had a well-stocked larder. The rats Clootie found were all unusually plump and sleek, the very models of ratdom, and I marvelled at their size. One day, quite to my consternation, I saw that my dear Duke of Dumplings, for he had by this point advanced quite far in Her Majesty's absent esteem, was limping and somewhat bedraggled when he brought me my daily prize. He had been cut about the face, with a notch taken out of his ear which still bled freely, and his left foreclaw had been torn out as with main force. I did not wonder how, for I could see the size of the beast he dragged to my hammock. It was a rat, but an enormous one, over half the size of Clootie himself, and quite a vicious-looking customer at that, with great yellow fangs and a musculature that would not have been out of place on a bull-baiting dog. I concealed my dismay as my cat. I couldn't help but think of him as such, for no one else on board cared particularly if he lived or died, gave a somewhat plaintive call to declaim his triumph. I fussed over him in quite a motherly fashion, bathed his wounds, and even got him to accept a bandage for his paw, though he gave me a stern rebuke in parallel slashes upon my other hand. It was while I was seated on a bundle of unused hammocks tending to these newer, fresher wounds that Humbert entered below decks. I had something of a black reputation among the crew at this point. Though I would comply with any orders that were directly given, they thought me peculiar for spending so much time in the cramped and stinking corridors of the Santo Domingo's belly, and honestly, it was no boon to me in turn. I craved the fresh ocean breeze and the joy of clambering on the ropes, watching the deck seem to swoop back and forth beneath me as the ship rolled. There are few pleasures on board a ship, and the beauty of the sea and the sky is one of the keenest. Below decks, the lowering darkness, the sloshing bilge water, the reek of tar, and the narrow pathways between net-packed crates of trade goods made me feel something like a rat myself, blindly moving through tunnels by touch and intuition. "Where's the pig?" Humbert asked through stained teeth. His tufts of dark hair stuck out wildly in every direction. I always felt Humbert had the look of a badly shaved hedgehog. "Ship's cook Piggins is preparing for the midday meal," I replied, attempting to convey with tone of voice that I disapproved of the disrespectful nickname. Piggins was quite a sweet old man, not to mention he was instrumental in my plan to keep out of sight for as much of the voyage as possible. "Well, tell him the captain wants a word about him nicking the stores," Humbert said. "Unless it was you, pussy cat." He gave me a snaggle-toothed snare of appraisal. I returned his gaze with frank dislike. "I checked the larder just the other day, and we're not unnaturally low on anything in particular. Nah, not food. Someone's been at the sailcloth and the gunpowder, all tore up and an armful gone missing at least. You and the pig are the only ones who spend much time down to hold. Why would either of us want sailcloth or gunpowder? What would we even do with it out here? Sell it back to the ship for tuppence?" My keen line of probing questions having apparently stunned him to silence, Humbert sucked his teeth until the candle flame in his skull flickered once more to life. "Just tell him the captain wants him," he said, and spat a brown streak onto the floor before scampering monkey-like up the ladder to the deck. With an exercise of willpower, I refrained from making a rude gesture at his retreating backside, and went about the business of putting him as far from my mind as possible. Preparing for the midday meal was a polite untruth, to disguise the fact that Piggins suffered from gout and dyspepsia and frequently felt too unwell to cook, moaning from his hammock that he would be eternally grateful if I would take over in the galley for the day, which service I was happy to provide, because it did not involve standing next to hazardously explosive cannons or being pelted with grape shot or rifle fire in the event we did encounter a viable prize ship. With my cat scratch cleaned and my unpleasant visitor gone, I started the water boiling for meat stew and dumped the flour into the mixing bowl for biscuit. We were over a month at sea by then, but there weren't too many grubs in the grain bags even so. I picked out the ones I spotted, gave them a rinse and added them to the stew pot instead. I'd heard tell that grubs and worms were as good as meat for nourishing the belly, and once at port in Singapore I'd seen a man with a trained dancing ape that he claimed subsisted almost entirely on mealworms. If it was good enough for an orangutan, it was good enough for Humbert, I reflected. They smelled lovely and meaty as they cooked up with the salt pork. I noticed as I cleaned up my mise en place, as the French call it, that the bottom of the flour bag had been torn open. Rats come everywhere man does, of course. And I knew my good lordship of Clootie Downs was doing his utmost to address the problem, but it still stirred feelings of disgust in my breast. I stared at the bag in my hands as though it had grown poison quills, thinking of those great yellow teeth gnawing and chewing in the hot and fetid darkness of the ship's hold, black eyes unseeing and spiked fur bristling. Filthy animals, living in stink and sewage, knowing only hunger and lust. With a start, I realized that the bottom of the flour sack was not ripped or gnawed as with blunted teeth, but had instead been cut, somewhat raggedly, as though with a set of the tiny sewing scissors that embroiderers use to cut threads, but the marks were surely of tools and not a diseased vermin's maw. I still devoutly believed in Piggins' innocence, if only because he was too simple to even imagine committing a crime against the ship. But perhaps Humbert was not wrong to believe that some conscious agent was at work in the ship's stores. Perhaps it was the same man who'd been stealing the cutlery. Forks and knives had been going missing on an almost daily basis throughout the voyage. I set those musings aside with the ruined bag and set about making Captain Adam's meal. His portion of stew received a judicious portion of our limited spice stores and one precious can of tinned milk and sugar for his pudding, where the men made do with molasses and, if they were lucky, dried fruit. I summoned the cabin boys, Jones and Mickins, to help me lug the grub up and ready the trestle table. I roused Piggins enough to have him take Captain Adams his meal and made sure he didn't smell too much like rum. The sailors ate in shifts, wolfing their food with the appetite that only hard work on the high seas can bring. It was in the midst of the chaos of serving and eating that the shout went up from on high and the alarm bell began to ring. The lookouts had spotted a fat Spanish trader wallowing low and clearly heavy laden, and the chase was on. A sabre was thrust into my hands, and I was shoved towards one of the cannon teams, preparing to clean and load the ton-weight gun, with shouts all around and the roaring sound of the sails being swung to catch the wind. This was precisely the situation I had been seeking so stringently to avoid. But I was helpless to escape the swirl of ecstatic rage that swept up the rest of the crew. Their faces twisted into grins, and their shouts were edged with a sharp and hungry joy. This was an appetite beyond what could be satisfied by cured meats and mealy flour, and one that I could not share in. The Spanish ship put up sail and made an unexpectedly fleet run for safety. The Santo Domingo lifted her own skirts and dashed after. We worked, pulling the ropes and keeping the cannons in readiness, but the air was tense and anxious, a sense of stagnancy to even the most frenetic motion as we waited to see if we would catch our prey. I do not have bonny Prince Clutie's predatory instincts, nor his patience, and the pressure wore upon me like a millstone. From my position, low on deck and without a spyglass, there was nothing to see but a blank ocean and no greater sense of what was happening, merely bearded men screaming orders amid flecks of spittle and the scramble of bodies as we sailors rushed to comply. One of the cannon teams fired prematurely and rattled my wits in my skull. The bitter smoke wafted across the deck and stung our eyes and noses, and I heard the sound of wood striking flesh as the boatswain took issue with the mishandling of our powder. It was a sweat-soaked afternoon, and by the time the sun had lowered and the news passed that the Spanish ship had slipped our grasp, we were all swollen and bleeding from a half-dozen tiny wounds, splinters and rope burns, and pockmarks where flecks of burning powder had landed on our skins. The frustrated bloodlust and unsated hunger for prize and plunder left the crew grumbling and fractious, and the fact that the evening meal was delayed, due to my unplanned absence from the galley, did little to ameliorate the simmering hostility. There were several fist-fights among the crew, and despite liberal application of the lash and stave, the mood remained sour. I retired to my hammock as early as I could manage and fell quickly into a troubled and unhealing sleep. When the bell rang, at first I thought we were attacked. All the sleeping men filtered up onto deck, groggy and stumbling, where we found a grim tableau. Captain Adams, wearing a rare smile, stood on the main deck by the boarding plank. Beside him was the unmistakable bulk of Piggins, blinking and darting his head every which way, his flaring nostrils making him look more like his namesake than ever. His neck was encircled by a hempen noose. The other shifts were already assembled in rough ranks around him. When Adams began to speak, announcing a litany of allegations of theft and shirking, and the faces around me grew sharp and hungry again, I wanted to turn away, but feared singling myself out in that rabid crowd. I settled for closing my eyes. In my head, the eyes of the sailors were black and beady, framed above jutting whiskers and ragged yellow fangs. I heard the thud of the board being dropped, and the strangled cry that was cut off abruptly, and finally, with a terrible, crunching snap. It reminded me appallingly of the noise of splitting the joint of a ham hock. Later that night, troubled by dreams of men and pigs, cats and rats, I woke in the dark with a terrible sense that something was awry. I felt dizzy and feverish, and the scrapes on my hands and knuckles itched abominably. After a bout of swirling vertigo, I gathered myself to sit up. As I did, the itching in my hands flared to a burning point, and I felt a furry warmth on my forearm. My first thought was that it was Clutie, but then the long, hairless tail wrapped about my arm just below the elbow, and I realized it was an enormous rat licking the seeping blood from my hands. I cried out in shock and disgust and flung the thing away, but it had bitten deep into the flesh between my knuckles when I had first moved, and my action tore a largish chunk from my hand. I heard the thump of the creature striking the opposite wall and the groans of the other men around me as I fumbled for a light. My hand fell upon a contraband candle stub and a packet of lucifers. Striking the match and holding the flickering light high, I beheld a horror beyond any I had previously witnessed. Every man of the half-dozen sailors who shared my bunk room had a black and humping shadow clinging to him, rats licking and nuzzling their small injuries, tasting men's blood with the air of lordlings sampling dainties at a feast. At the flare of light, their heads shot up, eyes like beads of pitch glinting in the dark. With eerie synchronicity, they dropped silently to the floorboard and fled through the door and away. I had only a moment or two to see them, and none of them clearly, but they all had the most unusual markings, dark forelimbs and pale rear. It gave them the look of sailors in uniform, with blue jackets and white breeches. The rats flowed out of the doorway in matched pairs as I clutched my bleeding hand and fumbled with the candle stub. The last to leave was the one with a gobbet of my own flesh in its mouth. The black fur on its otherwise grey head gave it a look of a swept-back captain's hat. It paused and gave me a look of purest malice and ill will, my blood still staining its chin, and then it fell into step with its comrades. Already there were grumblings and mutters from the other sailors, calls for me to put that damned light out, and the creaking of ropes as they turned in their hammocks. I couldn't imagine attempting to sleep again, not to mention my hand was bleeding rather badly, and I feared the consequence of a filthy bite. Circumspectly, I withdrew to the deck where the night shift was at work, keeping us set to our corrected course after our day-long chase had drawn us some distance away. I pulled up a bucket of water to wash my stinging hand and bandaged it with a strip of linen, then sat for a time under the stars to let the disgust and fear drain away. It was a lovely, clear night, nary a cloud to be seen, and the half-moon was shining near the horizon. I listened to the soft rushing of the water and the snapping of the sail lines until the bell had rung twice and the moon was high. Young Nesmith, who had charge of the night shift, stopped by once or twice on his rounds, and even asked if he should wake the ship's doctor, a haggard alcoholic called Garamond, but I demurred. The next several days were uneasy ones. I was busier than ever as the de facto new head chef, and I tumbled to bed exhausted each night. Yet I slept fitfully, waking up at every unexpected sound. And if you have never been on a sailing ship, let me assure you that those are plentiful. I felt haunted by the glare of that large rat, the captain, as I thought of him. He had looked upon me with a knowledge beyond that of a beast. The scents and signs of rats were everywhere, scat in the corners of the sleeping room when I woke, pungent urine in the larder, neat holes bored through cupboard doors and bags of milled flour. Most distressingly, my liege lord and only true friend on board, Sir Clutie, had disappeared. He had been in the habit of greeting me every morning in hopes of a little extra titbit with his fish trilling and twining round my legs while I worked, and of course coming to show off his latest prize when he had made a kill. I recalled his last battle, in which he had taken noble wounds and seemed almost matched by his foe, and my spirits quailed to think of his fate. At last, as I lay sleepless on the third night, I could take no more. I resolved to plumb the mystery to its depth, though I knew in my heart that there truly was no mystery, and all I would accomplish would be to commit Clutie Dumpling's rat-bitten body to the sea with full honours. I will not dissemble. I had shed more than one tear at the thought over the last few days, and I felt that finding his empty corpus would be the only way to bring myself closure. It's the way of things with the animals we keep and train. They live so short compared to us. It is better to harden oneself against their inevitable departure. But I have never had that knack. I slipped from the sleeping quarters and found a light, a proper hooded lantern this time. The candle stubs and sulphurous matches had disappeared over the last few days, likely confiscated. Open flames were not encouraged, particularly among the goods storage, where the walls were coated in tar and the spare ropes and sails were kept dry and flammable. It was utterly black in the hold, the beam from my lantern passing along the boxes and barrels like a searchlight in a prison yard. Despite the motion of the ship, the space in the hold felt still, dead, immobilized in time and space. I pushed through the narrow walkway, scanning each narrow gap and alley closely for a black-furred body. I heard creaks and groans all around me, wood and hemp flexing and relaxing, like the breath of a great beast that we all rode inside, a starved one, a great predator, frustrated of its prey and growing ravenous. Then I heard a scratching, a scrabbling, a rustle, and a chitter. I had already passed the food stores, the cloth, the straw. Instead of those expected locations, I was near the far end of the hold, where the powder room was. Uncertain, I lifted the key from the wall and opened the room to shine my lantern inside. At first I saw nothing. But then shadowy motion caught my eye. I saw one of the gunpowder barrels was gnawed open, and a trail of grey-black grains led from that to a rat hole in the wall of the room. A scaly tail was even now disappearing into the blackness and the spaces between. If my knowledge of the ship was accurate, that area was only a bilge, an empty space between the outer hull and the interior rooms. It was plausible enough as a haunt for rodents, but why would the crazed animals be hoarding gunpowder? The source of the mysterious noises resolved, if more bizarre in context. I made to withdraw. But as I turned, the beam of my lantern light chanced upon another object, one that shook me to my core. Clootie Dumpling, or what was left of him. He had been held by every limb like a man upon the rack, his paws split through with wrought iron nails from the ship's own stores and tied with crude ropes woven of hemp and linen shreds. He was splayed on his back and split open down the middle, his innards spread out in a gory augury, much chewed and in ruins. All around him were tiny bloody paw prints, rat trails, in a horrid circle, as if they'd stood around him like an audience at a hanging. His head was missing, but his white paws were unmistakable, even drenched in his own gore. There were no human prints, no sign of anything but rats. It was impossible, but the evidence was before me. The mess of offal was long dried. This had happened several days previously, at least. Probably the very night the rats had invaded the sleeping quarters. The sight of the ravaged body drove me to a frenzy I had never known I could reach. An inhuman snarl twisted my face, and I dashed back to the hold, snatching up one of the great hammers for splitting the beams. With a cry, I smashed the tool against the wall with the rat hole, splintering the wood apart. I heard the shouts of the sailors from above and behind, having heard the racket and seen my madness, but I ignored them. Twice, 3 times I smoked the walls of my own ship like a lunatic saboteur. On the 4th blow, the planks snapped. On the 5th, they fell into flinders, and I could see into the dead space beyond. I only had seconds to gape at what I found before rough hands wrestled me to the floor and pinned me down, but the image will haunt me for the rest of my life. Row upon row of rats were arrayed inside the walls in neat regimental lines. They had on white breeches made of sailcloth and blue jackets formed from shreds of old uniforms. Behind them, a miniature simulacrum of a ship with a ragged white sail. At their head, the large rat, the captain, waved a paring knife clutched in one oversized forepaw. He met my eyes and bared his teeth in a snarl. I felt that he knew me, that he recognized me. To a rat, a creature of smell, I was covered in odors both of cat and food, fear and desire, predator and prey, and now that he had slain my guardian, he would come for me. Beyond the hateful captain, a line of fuse burned slowly toward a tin cup that had been hammered into a narrower tube, with two more rats working a lit lucifer behind it. Ahead of the cup, a smaller rat, stripped of its uniform, was held trembling in place by a rope, and then the makeshift cannon went off with a tiny pop, launching a ball of shrapnelled cutlery like a grape shot and sending a tiny spout of ratty gore against the walls. It was ridiculous, play-acting, comical, a crude and bestial imitation of the men of the ship. But when 6 dozen beady black eyes turned simultaneously toward me, as dead as a shark's, but lit from within by mammalian malice, my soul shrank in revulsion and, yes, I will admit it, fear. I screamed as I fell, but not from pain or shock, and by the time I could see again, the rats had fled, leaving only a scattering of cloth and detritus. I pondered this long afterward, as I waited in the brig to be returned to land. Captain Adams was a hard man, but he was sensible to my pleas that I had been deranged by anger at the death of the ship's cat. Everyone aboard knew he was my especial pet. He intervened on my behalf so that I was merely dismissed and did not face hanging for an assault on one of Her Majesty's ships. The brig was a nauseous closet, cramped and stinking of feces and vomit, but what turned my stomach more than anything else was the sound of scratching and scampering in the spaces between the walls. Rat followed after man on every ship to every port and every continent and island in the world, carried our diseases, trailed behind us in a tide of mindless consumption. The rats were always with us, watching and learning. They had hunger of themselves, but from us they could learn cruelty and torture and war and hatred. That is what I had seen in the eyes of the great leader, the biggest rat, the captain. He knew me for his enemy, the master of the cat, and I knew he plotted my destruction. It is for that reason that I have ever since eschewed boats and even cities. I keep cats and ferrets and terriers by the brace. I twitch and jump at the slightest sound within the walls, and I wonder, even now, what will come when mankind eventually passes from this earth and the world has a chance to be remade anew. Will our follies survive us, taught to even the lowliest of our subjects? What hope can there be for peace if even humanity cannot learn it? The candle burns low, and so I end my tale here. I will not suffer the dark. Not any more.
That was Nathaniel Matthews Lee's The Ship's Cat, as read by Tony Walker. Tony Walker is the narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, as well as being the author and narrator of his own stories. Since May 2024, he is a full-time narrator and accepts commissions. You can reach him by email at classicghostpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, Tony. Well, children of the night, the hour is late and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as we meet the nightmares beneath the boughs for more Tales to Terrify.